All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going deep on something pretty fascinating.
Implicature.
Implicature. And, you, our listeners, always love to really get a good grasp on things. And, well, in the world of language, this is a big one. Because implicature, well, it's basically the art of hinting at things without actually, saying them directly.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. It's like imagine a royal decree, but delivered with a subtle nod and a very carefully chosen phrase. That kind of gets at the heart of it, I think. It's both the act of suggesting something beyond the literal words and then also the actual implied meaning itself. And what's really interesting is these unspoken messages, well, they can come from different places. Sometimes they're kind of built into the words we choose, and sometimes they just pop up because of the situation, the context of the conversation. And we can sort of think about these as, two big categories, right? Like the ones that come from linguistic conventions and then the ones that depend on like shared understanding and the specific situation.
Okay, so why does this even matter? I mean, why do we as speakers choose to imply things instead of just coming right out and saying them? What's the point of all this subtle dance of language?
Well, it serves a lot of really important purposes, actually. For one thing, it makes communication a lot more efficient. We can pack in layers of meaning without having to spell everything out like we're, talking to a child. Plus, it's super important for social interactions. Sometimes a gentle suggestion is just way better or more polite than a blunt statement, right? And then there's this interesting thing. Immature can actually help us walk that fine line between truth and deception. You can mislead someone without technically lying. Think about like all the nuances you find in courtly pronouncements or diplomatic exchanges, things like that. And then beyond all that, implicature actually shapes the style and flow of language itself. So understanding implicature, it's not just about understanding what words mean on the surface. It's like a key to unlocking the deeper structure of how language really works.
Right. So to really break this down, we're going to be looking at a really solid source, the implicature entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And in this entry, it kind of positions implicature as this core concept in pragmatics. Pragmatics is all about, how language works in real-life situations. And the entry shows us how implicature helps us see the difference between the basic meaning of a sentence and the richer meaning that's actually being communicated, which is, much more interesting.
Exactly right. And our mission today, dear listener, is to make all of this crystal clear for you. We want to go beyond just the definitions, uncover all the surprising things about implicature, and really give you a practical understanding of how it shapes, well, basically every conversation you have.
Let's start with the main person who came up with this idea, speaker implicature, and the Stanford entry points to H.P. Grice as the real pioneer in this area. So what was his big insight?
Well, his big idea was that there's often a pretty big difference between what a speaker's words literally mean and what they're actually trying to get across. And that gap, that unspoken meaning, is the heart of speaker implicature.
And the entry has this great example with two people, Alan and Barb, who are talking about a party that Paul is throwing. Alan asks as Barb is going, and she says, "I have to work." But she doesn't actually say she isn't going, right? But it's pretty obvious that's what she means.
Right, exactly. Barb said she had to work, but what she really meant was that she wouldn't be at the party. So in Gleiss's terms, she implicated her absence, and her abscess is the implicature. You see, the sentence itself, "I have to work," doesn't automatically mean she can't go to a party. It's the context. We all understand that you don't usually go to parties while you're working, and that understanding is what connects the actual words to the intended meaning.
And then there's another really interesting example about Carla and Don, and it's taking place during a blizzard. So Carla asks Don about the weather, and Don, who's, a truck driver and having to deal with this blizzard, he says, "The weather's lovely." But, I mean, come on, the irony is so thick you could cut it with a knife.
Oh, absolutely. He said the weather was lovely, but he meant the exact opposite. He meant it was awful, probably dangerous even. So he implicated the severity of the blizzard through that ironic statement. It's a great example of how irony works as a type of speaker implicature. You say one thing,
Yeah.
but you mean the opposite.
And then the entry makes this connection between implicating and speech acts, which is like the idea that when we speak, we're actually doing things with our words. And it mentions illocutionary acts and indirect speech acts. So where does implicature fit into all of this?
Well, implicating itself is an illocutionary act. When you speak, you're trying to achieve something. And in this case, you're trying to get across a meaning that goes beyond your literal words. And because you're conveying one meaning by saying something else, it's also a type of indirect speech act. The entry makes the point that while Searle also worked on indirect speech acts, Grice's theory of implicature gives us a different way to understand them.
And Grace was super specific about how he defined saying, right? He wasn't just talking about making sounds with your mouth.
Absolutely. For Grice, saying meant saying that something is the case. It's called a locutionary act. So Barb said that she had to work, and the specific words she used, that's just one way of doing that. The entry even mentions that famous Yogi Berra quote, Texas has a lot of electrical votes, as an example of saying words without really meaning them in a way that makes an actual claim. And, just like Dawn in the Blizzard, he said the weather's lovely, but he didn't intend for that to be taken literally.
So this really shows us why it's so important to understand implicatures. I mean, imagine if Carl had just took Dawn at his word. She'd have a totally wrong idea about what was going on, and she could even make bad decisions based on that misunderstanding.
Exactly. Misinterpreting implicatures can lead to some serious problems in communication. And the entry brings up this interesting distinction between lying and misleading. Like, if Barb knew she didn't actually have to work, then her statement would be a straight up lie. But if she did have to work, but she was also planning on going to the party anyway, then her statement might be misleading, but it wouldn't be a lie about her work.
And that subtle difference between saying and implicating, I bet that's really important in legal situations, especially for people who are testifying in court.
Yeah, definitely. In legal context, they really focus on the exact words that are said. A witness might try to give a false impression by implying something, but legally, what matters is what they actually stated as a fact.
Okay, now this is where it gets really interesting. Implicatures aren't directly stated. They have to be inferred by the listener. So can you walk us through that process of inference?
Sure. When we hear someone say something, we automatically try to figure out what they mean, taking into account the whole situation. So with Alan and Barb, Alan figures out that Barb isn't coming to the party by thinking about a few things. What she actually said, I have to work. The question he asked her, the assumption that she's trying to answer his question, and what he already knows about her and about work in general. All those things come together and suggest the implied meaning.
So we, the audience, are inferring the implicature, but the speaker, like Barb, is actually implicating it. It's two sides of the same communication coin, but they're different actions.
Right. Implicating is a way of expressing something, and inferring is how our brains understand it. And the entry makes a good point for people who are fluent in a language. Recognizing implicatures usually happens automatically. We just get it. Like, with Barb, we instantly understand she's saying no to the invitation.
It's like our brains are wired to look for those hidden layers of meaning. And the entry even mentions that there's a lot of research going on in pragmatics, trying to figure out exactly how we learn and process these implicatures.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done to understand those cognitive processes. And the entry also broadens things a bit. Grace was initially focused on how we convey information through statements, but the idea of implication applies to other ways of communicating too, like asking questions, giving commands, even expressing attitudes through what we say or don't say.
Okay, we've got a good handle on speaker implicature now. So the Stanford entry then moves on to this distinction between conversational and conventional implicature. What's the big difference between those two?
The main difference is whether the implicature comes from the particular conversation or whether it's baked into the meaning of the words themselves or the grammar of the sentence. So conversational implicatures depend on context, they can change, while conventional implicatures are more fixed, they're determined by the rules of the language.
Let's go back to Barb's answer for a second. When she said she couldn't go to the party, that was clearly a conversational implicature because it was tied to Alan's specific question and what they both understood about the situation. Like, if he had asked her about her plans for the whole weekend, her saying, I have to work, could have implied something totally different. Maybe that she had to work all weekend.
Exactly. The context is everything. Now, let's look at conventional implicature. The entry uses this example. The Queen is English and therefore brave. The important word here is therefore.
Right. Whether or not the Queen is actually brave, using therefore, implies that there's a cause and effect relationship. Like, her being brave is a result of her being English.
Exactly. By using that sentence, the speaker is conventionally implicating a connection between being English and being brave. They imply it through the inherent meaning of therefore, even though they don't actually say being English makes you brave. And the entry lists other words that often trigger conventional implicatures too, like but, even to, still, yet.
It's so interesting that these conventional implicatures can also be triggered by the structure of the sentence itself, not just individual words. Like in the example, Ravel, a Spaniard, wrote Spanish-style music.
Right, that little phrase, a Spaniard, conventionally implicates that Ravel is Spanish. But if the speaker knew Ravel was actually French, then they'd be misleading the listener with that implicature, even though the main part of the sentence doesn't actually say anything false about his nationality or his music.
So a false conversational implicature makes the statement misleading but grammatically correct. But a false conventional implicature makes the statement sound wrong somehow. Kind of like the question, is the Queen English and therefore brave?
Exactly. Because therefore it carries that conventional implication of a link between being English and being brave. Asking the question that way sounds weird, as if it's assuming something that might not be true. It's similar to how the question, have you cheated again, implies that the person cheated before.
But not all conventional implicatures work exactly like presuppositions, do they? The entry uses the example, Jack knows that 51 is prime.
That's right. That sentence conventionally implicates that 51 is a prime number. However, even though 51 isn't actually prime, the sentence itself is still grammatically correct. It's factually wrong, not grammatically wrong. The speaker implies that 51 is prime. They don't actually state it as a fact.
Okay. The entry then brings up an argument made by Potts, who says that you can't use a sentence according to its conventional meaning without also triggering its conventional implicatures. But there are examples with conditional statements and irony that seem to challenge that idea.
Yeah, they do. Take the conditional statement. If the Queen is English, and bravery is a consequence of being English, then the Queen is English and therefore brave. Here, the therefore is within the second part of the conditional. But the whole statement doesn't necessarily mean that the speaker believes bravery comes from being English, because that idea is part of the hypothetical situation set up in the first part. So the conditional structure basically suspends the usual implicature of therefore. And similarly, in a sarcastic statement like, Trump, the stable genius, negotiated a brilliant trade deal, the phrase, the stable genius, doesn't imply that Trump is a stable genius because the sarcasm signals that the speaker means the opposite.
So it seems like it's the act of directly stating something, using the conventional meaning of a sentence, that really brings those conventional implicatures to the forefront. But the way we put that sentence into a larger structure, or the specific context of the conversation, can neutralize those implicatures.
Exactly. Now, the entry also talks about a broader understanding of conventional, more like customary usage. And this is different from Grice's idea of conventional implicature, which is more focused on semantics. The example they use is about athletes who smoke.
Right, the statement, some athletes smoke, often implies that not all athletes smoke. Even though that's not a strict logical consequence of the word some, it's more like a pragmatic convention, a common way we interpret and use that word.
Exactly. And this brings us to Grace's concept of generalized conversational implicatures, or GCIs. These are implicatures that usually come up without any special context. Levinson later called them default inferences. But as we see in the example with Fred and Gina, they're not always real defaults. The specific situation can easily override or change the expected implicature.
So some athletes smoke might generally imply not all, but if the question is just whether any athletes smoke, then that same statement might just imply that the speaker knows at least one athlete who smokes.
Exactly. And the fact that a word like bank can have different customary meanings, depending on whether you're talking about a financial institution or the edge of a river, shows that having multiple generalized conversational implicatures doesn't mean they become semantic implicatures in Grice's technical sense.
Now, one important thing about these generalized conversational implicatures is that you can usually cancel them.
Right. Yes, you can explicitly cancel them by adding more information, like saying, some athletes smoke. In fact, all of them do. Or they can be implicitly canceled by the context. Like, if it's clear the speaker is intentionally downplaying something, then the usual not all implication that comes with some might just disappear.
The entry then gets into some pretty complex stuff, like the question of whether conversational implicatures can ever act as entailments. Usually they don't. But there are examples like the question, is Tom 65 or blind? And the answer, Tom is 65.
Yeah, that's a subtle one. Saying Tom is 65 in that situation might strongly imply Tom is 65 or blind, which is logically entailed by Tom is 65. There's a debate in pragmatics about whether cancelability really separates conversational implicatures from entailments in every case, because some argue that even seemingly clear conversational implicatures can be canceled in implicit or very specific ways.
Finally, this section of the entry talks about whether conversational implicatures are detachable, meaning are they dependent on the exact words used? Generally, they're not. If you convey the same meaning with different words, you'll probably get the same implicature, like with Barb's "I have to work." But there are exceptions, like metalinguistic implicatures.
Right. If Harry asks Irene the English name for a certain bird, and Irene says, "This is a widgeon," she's implying that widgeon is the English name. But if she had used a German sentence that meant the same thing, she would have implicated something different, the German name. But semantic implicatures are considered non-detachable because they're tied to the actual meaning of the words, not the specific way those meanings are expressed.
Wow, this is a seriously intricate web of ideas. So, after exploring all these different types of implicature, the entry shifts to the idea of sentence implicature. How does this build on what we've talked about already?
Remember how we said Grice's original idea of implicature was all about what the speaker meant? Well, over time, the word implicate started being used for sentences themselves, especially when talking about conventional and generalized conversational implicatures.
So, while Barb, the speaker, implicated that she wouldn't be at the party, the sentence, "I have to work," doesn't inherently carry that implication on its own. But a sentence like, "Some athletes smoke," does seem to inherently imply not all athletes smoke, no matter what the speaker specifically intends in that moment.
Exactly. It's kind of like how the word plane means airplane, even if someone uses it while talking about woodworking. The sentence has a potential implicature built into its common understanding. And as the entry emphasizes, knowing about these sentence implicatures is a big part of being competent in a language. Someone who doesn't realize that some usually implies not all might accidentally mislead someone or fail to communicate what they really mean.
All right, let's move into the territory of common forms of conversational implicature. The entry points out that a lot of these happen all the time and are really important for everyday communication.
Absolutely. Some of the most well-known are figures of speech, or tropes, like irony, hyperbole, understatement, and metaphor. People have been aware of these for centuries, and they're often taught in school as ways to make language more interesting. We saw irony in action with Don's sarcastic comment about the weather. He could have also used litotes, like saying the weather isn't exactly ideal, or hyperbole, like the weather is apocalyptic, to get across a similar implied meaning.
And those figures of speech, except for litotes, they're usually non-literal, right? The listener is supposed to know that the speaker doesn't mean what they're literally saying.
Exactly. The fact that the statement is obviously different from reality is a big clue. And these figures of speech help us make our communication more colorful, lively, and emphatic. But the entry points out that there are also non-figurative modes of speech that rely heavily on implicature. These were highlighted by Grice's work. They include relevance implicatures, like Barb's informative response, quantity or scalar implicatures, some implying not all, ignorance implicatures, some implying I don't know of all, and metalinguistic implicatures, like when Irene named the bird.
And even though these non-figurative modes might not be taught in school or have fancy names, they're just as common and natural as figures of speech. And unlike figures of speech, they tend to be more literal, right? The speaker usually means what they're saying, but they're conveying an extra layer of meaning through implication.
Right. They serve different purposes, not just making speech more stylish. Now, there are a couple of these non-figurative modes that do have common names, like damning with faint praise and loose use or speaking loosely. An example of that would be like if Mike said dinner would be at 6, but what he really meant was sometime around 6.
So all these figures and modes of speech are common, useful practices that we keep using because of precedent and because everyone accepts them.
Yeah, we learn them through interacting with other people, and we use them to understand what others mean and to guess how our own words will be understood. They're less arbitrary than the basic meanings of words, but speakers still have some choice in which forms of implicature they use.
And since these conventions don't attach implicatures to specific grammatical structures, they don't create sentence implicatures on their own.
Exactly. They're ways of using language, not built-in features of the sentences themselves.
Well, this has been a really enlightening look into the fascinating world of implicature. It's amazing how much meaning we communicate and understand that goes beyond the actual words we use.
It really is. And for you, our dedicated listener, understanding this stuff gives you a much deeper appreciation for the subtle art of communication. It goes beyond knowing definitions and gets to the core of how we connect and understand each other through language.
So next time you're having a conversation, think about all the unspoken meanings that are being exchanged. It happens in small talk and in big discussions. How does knowing about implicature change how you interpret those interactions and the intentions of the people you're talking to? What are the bigger consequences of using or misinterpreting these implied meanings on purpose?
Those are really important questions to think about. Pay attention to the implicatures in your own speech and in what you hear others say. It's a constant journey of linguistic discovery, and a good understanding of implicature is a valuable tool for navigating the complex world of language and human interaction.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into implicature. Until next time.